Hello there, my name is David Postansky and welcome to the Geek Battle YouTube channel. On today's video, we're going to be talking about this. Back to the Future, the musical. Now, I just saw Back to the Future, the musical the other day. It opened a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic started in Manchester in the UK, and it quickly got stopped just because of the pandemic. But then it reopened in London's West End a few months ago, and I finally got to see it, and it is brilliant. But this is not a review video of Back to the Future, the musical. It's Back to the Future, we already know it's brilliant, but what I am going to be talking about today are all of the major differences between Back to the Future, the film, and Back to the Future on stage. So without further ado, make sure you smash that subscribe button if you haven't on the Geek Battle YouTube channel, and let's get into it. So let's start things off with perhaps the most heartbreaking change of all between Back to the Future the film and Back to the Future the stage show, and that there are no dogs in it. There is no Einstein in 1985, and there is no Copernicus back in 1955. Now, Back to the Future fans will know that the dog in 1955 wasn't given the name Copernicus until the sequels, but regardless, Doc does not have a dog. So the obvious reason why they don't have a dog on the stage show is because with lots of special effects in the show and loud music, the dog could get frightened. And this is a very special effects heavy show. So unfortunately, no Einstein. Big change number 2. When at the beginning of the story Marty arrives at Doc's place and then he tries to play the guitar and he blows up the speaker, Marty gets a phone call from Doc telling him to meet him at the Twin Pines Mall later that night. However, in the musical version, there is some device that Doc has invented which recognises when Marty has entered the residence, and it just plays this voice clip. So it's not a live phone call, it's just a repeated clip which says, "Hey Marty, you've got to come and meet me tonight at the Twin Pines Mall." I think the reason they do this is having a little thing on the stage which shows the waveform as Doc is speaking is a bit more visual than just having Doc on the side of the stage, which would spoil his entrance, and you can't just have him be a voiceover. So it works a little bit better for visual purposes. Change number 3, Marty isn't too darn loud. Now, in the movie, Marty and his band, the Pinheads, try out to be the band to play at the school disco, and they get rejected, with Huey Lewis, who sings The Power of Love, making a cameo to say, through a megaphone, that you're just too darn loud. In this one, it is Strickland who has the megaphone and basically tells him that what he was doing was crap. So, no Huey Lewis here, but we do get a reference to Huey Lewis later because Jennifer says that she has an Uncle Huey who is in the music industry and he'd be coming to town the next day, and we get a guy turn up who is Uncle Huey, who is clearly based on Huey Lewis. Change number 4. Now, as mentioned earlier, there is no Einstein in the stage adaptation of Back to the Future, so instead of Einstein being the world's first time traveller, it's just Doc. Now, I'll be honest, I understand why they did this because they can't have a dog, although they perhaps could have had an animatronic one and then just said that he's going into kennels or something, who knows. The idea that Doc is the first one to test out the time machine just by going forward 5 minutes in time in this version, not just 1 minute like Einstein did, it takes a little something away from Doc having to wait until the end of the film to be able to go back in time or forward in time himself. Change number 5, and this is a huge one. There are no Libyans in this. There are no Libyan terrorists who Doc stole the plutonium from. We don't quite know where he stole it from, I don't think. And basically, instead of getting shot by terrorists and dying and needing the bulletproof vest at the end, instead he wore a bad radiation suit that he had from his Manhattan Project days, or something like this that he says, and he just succumbs to radiation poisoning. Marty then gets into the time machine to race off to try and get help from a hospital without taking Doc with him, which you could say makes sense if he's radioactive, but honestly, this is just a little bit of a weaker change. But they just brush past it, we accept it, and it's still Back to the Future in spite of this. Change number 6. Doc has basically made the time machine KITT from Knight Rider. Like, the car is now voice activated and will only start from Doc's own voice. This makes it 1, a little bit like Kit from Knight Rider, 2, a little bit like Alexa or Siri or one of these personal assistants, and 3, and here's what's interesting about it, it's also perhaps an unintentional nod and a wink to Biff's car from Back to the Future Part 2, where the mechanic says, do you have a kill switch on it? And Biff says, no one can start this car but me. But in this case, no one can start the time machine but the Doc. Change number 7, we don't meet Old Man Peabody. Now, earlier on when Doc's suit doesn't sufficiently protect him, he also doesn't bring a suit for Marty at all, and that comes into a change that happens later in the show, but it does mean that Old Man Peabody doesn't turn up because he can't see that Marty is dressed like a spaceman, mutating into human form, and he can't shoot at him. And also because the time machine can only be activated by Doc's voice, Marty can't drive it away from where it is crashed in the barn. So a few changes here, but I understand why they did this, because if Marty had got to do a costume change into the radiation suit, he'd have had to have done it on the stage. And also, if we had got Old Man Peabody there chasing him, then we'd have had Marty run away, and it would have required another big scene of the time machine driving away. And that would have been a little bit of a hassle. And that brings us to change number 8. Because Marty doesn't have the radiation suit, Old Man Peabody can't think he's an invader from outer space, and that also means that Marty can't try to convince George that he is Darth Vader and comes from the planet Vulcan. So he can't convince George that he's going to melt his brain as a reason for why he should ask out Jennifer. They just kind of skip over this detail, but they do give a couple of nods and winks to it, because at the beginning of the second act, the Doc has a dream sequence which is about the future, and it kind of looks like the captain's deck from Star Trek. And also just before the interval, there is a big chase sequence where instead of saying I am Darth Vader to George, Marty somehow gets a lightsaber. Don't really understand how this bit happened, but he says to Biff, like, I am your father, or something like this, and they have a Darth Vader reference in there, and it wasn't as good, but it was fun regardless. Change number 9. Now, one of the big things about the changes that happen throughout this story is a lot of them are vehicle based. Now, we get the time machine on the stage and it moves across, and we get lots of projections which make it look like it's zooming around and travelling through time, but we do not get any other vehicles. And in Back to the Future, there are more vehicles involved than what you can perhaps imagine at first. But when you think about it, there are quite a few vehicles involved in the story of Back to the Future. So because the time machine is the only proper vehicle that we get on stage, we don't have Lorraine's dad hitting Marty with the car when he pushes George out the way, after George fell out of the tree when he was peeping Tom spying on Lorraine. Now, instead, what we have happen is George falls out of the tree and he lands on top of Marty, and there's a big branch on top of Marty. And then later on, Marty's like, hey, do you remember the other day when I broke your fall? Instead of saying the other day when I saved your life. And again, I think this change is a little bit for the worse, because it was something that meant more that Marty saved George's life to get his trust into building that early relationship there. Change number 10. Jerry Lewis is swapped for Daffy Duck. Now, in the film, when Marty first meets 1955 Doc and tries to convince him that he is from the future, Doc asks Marty who is the president in 1985, to which Marty correctly responds, Ronald Reagan, to which Doc responds, Ronald Reagan, the actor? Who is the vice president, Jerry Lewis? Now, that worked back in the day, but nowadays probably less people do know who Jerry Lewis is. So he responds, who is the vice president? Daffy Duck. So Daffy Duck is obviously more universally known. He could have said Mickey Mouse, but either way, it works. Change number 11. Biff now only has 2 henchmen instead of 3. In the movie, Biff's gang comprises of Biff, Match, 3D and Skinhead. And 3D is definitely in the musical, but I wasn't quite sure if it was meant to be Match or Skinhead, but either way, there was only 2 henchmen instead of 3. Change number 12. George now asks Lorraine out at the school instead of at the diner. Now, we all remember the scene in the movie where George says, I'm your density. I mean your destiny. And then Biff turns up and crashes the party, Marty gets involved, and then it leads into the car chase, and Biff ends up in the manure. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't quite play out, because once again, they don't have any other vehicles in this play except for the time machine. So Marty does grab a skateboard, which is from like a cleaning lady who's got like a tray of like cleaning products on a board, and he lifts it off, and now he's got a skateboard, and that's a nice little nod to him taking like the box car from the kid and making it into a skateboard. But we don't get the chase with the car. Instead, we get George and Marty being chased by Biff and his gang through the school. It's very elaborate, but the thing that was a little bit unforgivable for me is that Biff ends up in like a dumpster and gets a pot of spaghetti on his head instead of getting manure all over him. So the running gag throughout the Back to the Future series of "I hate manure" is gone. And to answer the question of if this is a change for the worse, no shit. Change number 14, the photo of Marty and his siblings is played out a little bit differently. Now, because this is on stage, they can't just show us a close-up of a Polaroid photograph, and instead it always has Marty put the photograph into an overhead projector so that we can see it nice and big on the stage. That isn't the change I'm talking about though, because instead of it's his brother Dave's hair getting cut off, and then his head getting cut off, and eventually himself losing a hand and just being erased that way, the brother goes a little bit out of focus and then disappears entirely. Later on, when Linda is going to disappear, we get a weird scene where they show the projection randomly, which isn't with the overhead projector, and you actually hear a voice like, "Save us, Marty." The other thing of note about the photograph of Marty and his siblings is it now appears to have been taken at Monument Valley, which is where Back to the Future Part 3 was filmed for the opening scene where he was chased by the Native Americans. Change number 15, back to more missing cars, and they don't get more missing than this, because the scene where Lorraine and Marty park, and then Biff comes and beats up Marty, and then George has to save Lorraine, the car is in the stage show, but it's not there. It is literally two chairs on the stage, just with some light to mark out the car. The dialogue in the stage show does show that this was meant to be them in the car, because it is said, "Do you mind if we park?" And then later on, Biff says something about "get away from the car" or something like that. But either way, there is no car there, and it is a little bit odd because this is the only instance of a piece of set or prop being mined in the stage show. Change number 16, Lorraine doesn't smoke in the stage show. Now, in the film, when Lorraine and Marty park when they've arrived at the school dance, first Lorraine gets out a cigarette and goes to smoke it, and Marty takes it from her, and then she goes to get out some alcohol, and Marty's like, "Jesus, you drink too?" And then Lorraine's like, "You're starting to sound like my mother," or whatever. And the difference is in the stage show, Lorraine gets out some alcohol, and Marty just takes that away from her but doesn't stop her from smoking because she doesn't smoke. What's interesting about this change is when Marty first arrives back in 1955, there are some girls who are singing a song about what things are like in 1955 and about the benefits of smoking, and Marty does actually get a cigarette there, and I think he hands it back. But we also do get Mr. Strickland smoking. A locker is opened and he is smoking inside a locker to great comic effect. Change number 17. Marty ends up trapped inside a dumpster instead of inside the trunk of a car. Now, once again, cars are a victim of not appearing in the stage show outside of the DeLorean, but we do get this one that works quite well. Then when Biff and his gang take away Marty after Marty and Lorraine are in the car, they dump him into a dumpster, but then Marvin Berry comes along, opens it up, helps him out, but then someone else just slams the lid down on his hand, which means that he's injured and now Marty needs to play at the school dance. That works quite well, and I don't mind that change at all. Speaking of Marvin Berry, he doesn't call his cousin Chuck. Now, obviously the joke is that whilst Marty is playing Johnny Be Good, Marvin Berry phones up his cousin Chuck and is like, "Hey, you know that new sound you're looking for? Well, listen to this." And then he listens to Johnny Be Good, which creates the idea that did Chuck Berry get the idea of Johnny Be Good from Marty, who then got the idea from Chuck Berry, and it creates one of these paradox kind of things. Now, in this, because it is a stage musical, they're not going to have this song being interrupted just by dialogue, so the joke about Chuck Berry is just cut. Change number 19. Doc gets the help of Goldie Wilson to rig up the weather experiment, which is the cables that connect to the clock tower that will conduct the electricity through to the time machine. Now, two interesting details are added here. Firstly, that Doc needed this help because he has a terrible fear of heights, and that plays into the fact that later on Doc is going to have to be at the top of the clock tower and he's almost going to fall off. And it also plays into the idea is that Doc then pays Goldie Wilson some money, which helps him pay for his night school, which helps him to go on to become Mayor of Hill Valley. Change number 20. Doc sends Marty back in time forward to 1985 to 10 minutes after when he left. Now, because the DeLorean is activated only by the Doc's voice, we can't have the idea that Marty's like, right, I've just got a time machine, I'll go back in time to try to save the Doc. Now, the reason for this we're going to reveal in a moment, because I figured out for why they made this change, but they made it so that to avoid paradoxes, Marty is sent back 10 minutes after he left. Change 21. The Doc just jogs over to Marty when Marty arrives back in 1985. Now, this explains the previous change that I mentioned for why Marty was sent back 10 minutes after he initially left 1985. The reason for this is because we'd have had to have had another scene with Marty driving the car back to the Twin Pine Malls, so it does mean that that doesn't happen and we don't find out that it's now the Lone Pine Mall. So instead we just need an excuse for why Doc can suddenly turn up without them having to have another driving scene, and because Marty was sent 10 minutes into the future after he left, it means that Doc has had time to run over from the mall to meet Marty outside the clock tower. Change 22. After Marty wrote a letter and warned Doc that he was going to get shot by terrorists in the film, then Doc found out and wore a bulletproof vest. Now, obviously, he wasn't shot by terrorists in the stage show and instead died of radiation poisoning. Now, the implication of Doc knowing to have a better radiation suit is Doc would have had to have pretended to be dying from radiation poisoning, just so Marty would go back to 1955 and keep the time loop in order to avoid paradoxes. This change is slightly worse than the original films, as Marty's letter warned Doc that he would be shot, so wore a bulletproof vest to protect himself. This meant that when Doc was shot, he would survive and Marty would still end up going back in time, which was necessary. As if he didn't get shot, Marty wouldn't have gone back in time to be able to warn Doc that he was going to get shot, and he would still end up getting shot again. This is a paradox which was only solved by Doc allowing himself to get shot, as originally happened, which led to the complete loop of Marty heading off back in time. In the musical, Doc would have to pretend that he was dying of radiation poisoning just so that Marty would rush off to get help and end up going back in time and then warning Doc so that he'd know to get a radiation suit, because if he just put on a radiation suit and is like, I'm okay, then Marty wouldn't have ended up going back in time, which meant Doc wouldn't have got the warning, which would have meant that he wouldn't have been okay and he would have died of radiation poisoning all over again, which in turn would have meant that Marty would have gone back in time and this loop would go on and on forever. Change 23. As mentioned earlier, there is no Lone Pine Mall. Now, we get the Twin Pine Malls at the beginning and we see a prominent sign, just as we do in the movie, of the Twin Pines Mall. But because Marty doesn't return to the Twin Pines Mall, he doesn't find out that it is now the Lone Pines Mall. Now, what's interesting is that when Marty time travels back to 1955 originally, we get a lot of projection, and I think we do see that he knocks over one of the pine trees. But we just don't find out that it is changed from Twin Pines Mall to Lone Pines Mall in the musical. Change number 24. Marty's sister Linda now ends up with a boyfriend called Craig. Now, because I'm British, I would pronounce the name Craig, which is what I think the name is, but in American, they pronounce it as Craig. So anyway, the name is Craig, but I think I'd say Craig, like Craigslist. That's not the point. Anyway, in the film we get a scene where Marty's brother Dave says to his sister Linda that there was a message either from a Craig or a Greg, and she's like, which one was it, Craig or Greg? Which suggests that she knows someone called both Craig and someone called Greg, and either one of them may have been interested in her as a potential girlfriend. Now, in the musical version, she's got quite a bit of one of the early songs where she says that she wants a date, and at the end of the show here, she has that date turn up, and it turns out that Craig is the boyfriend, not Greg. Sorry, Greg. Now, one other point that's quite interesting about this is it means that for the first time in the show we get to see a character that was previously only mentioned and never seen. Craig doesn't have any lines, but he does have a physical presence, whereas in the movies all we do is hear the name. Change 25. There is now a thing called George McFly Day. Now, because it's a musical, you need a scene that's going to have all of the cast of characters on stage for a big finale at the end. Whereas obviously in the original film, you just had Jennifer, Marty and Doc flying off into the future in a now flying DeLorean. So what they've done is that instead of having the scene where Marty is just at home and Biff runs in saying to George, here's your new book, Mr. McFly, and it's called A Match Made in Space, instead it's like a big celebratory day that apparently George McFly has become Hill Valley's favourite son and favourite author, and so he's got a whole day just to celebrate the launch of his new book, which is called Back to the Future Part 4. Now this is a little nod and a wink to the fact that there obviously isn't a Back to the Future Part 4 in terms of a real film, although this gives us hope. Major change number 26. At the end of the show, Marty and Doc get into the time machine and the car actually flies. It's incredible on stage, but as a big change from the film, they don't take Jennifer with them. Now the fact that Jennifer hasn't gone with them is quite a significant change because it obviously would change the plot of Back to the Future 2. Now, it's quite possible that they're making this stage show, they know they're making Back to the Future the musical, not Back to the Future 2 or Back to the Future 3 the musicals, not Back to the Future Trilogy the musical, and they just don't care that they've messed up the plot of Back to the Future 2. And I say that for the biggest reason. Major change number 27, and this is the biggest change of anything that happens in Back to the Future the musical compared to Back to the Future the movie, and that is that Back to the Future 2 cannot happen. And the reason for this is, as mentioned earlier, it is established that the time machine, the DeLorean, is voice activated and will only respond to Doc's voice. Because of this, if the plot of Back to the Future 2 did happen, which already it can't because Jennifer isn't with them, but say they tweaked it and Jennifer suddenly hopped on board, or they went back for Jennifer, whatever, because the car is activated only by Doc's voice, it means that old Biff cannot steal the time machine to take the Gray's Sports Almanac with him back to 1955, which means that Doc and Marty wouldn't need to go back to 1955 to try to change time from the bad timeline, which means basically Back to the Future 2 and therefore Back to the Future 3 simply cannot happen. They do not happen, and it hasn't happened. So anyway, I've spoken about all of the changes between Back to the Future the movie and Back to the Future the stage show. Now, despite any of these changes, it doesn't really spoil the enjoyment of the show for me, because it was still 99% what you'd expect from Back to the Future. The songs were all great, the performances were fantastic, and I would still very much recommend you go and see it. But just be prepared that there are these changes. Now, I'm sure there were some other changes as well, but literally I watched this once, and so I really just tried to memorise all of the changes. Because I'm a big Back to the Future fan, as soon as I got home I was like, there was this change and this change and this change, and I came up with these 27 or so. So if there are any other changes that you're aware of, just put a comment into the comment section and I'd love to hear about them, and I might make some more videos about Back to the Future. I will definitely make some more videos about Back to the Future, but I might make some more about the musical if people like this one. And anyway, so I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please take a moment to smash that subscribe button, the red subscribe button just down here or wherever it is appearing on your screen. It would help the channel grow a lot. Hope you've enjoyed this, and until next time, Great Scott!